Hello. Oh, welcome this evening to Lighthouse Books and this wonderful event. I thought we'd be in the garden. I was still dallying about in the garden. Trying to cheer am I? I should have been after you. I was like, no, welcome this evening to Lighthouse Books and to a fabulous hour. I'm sure it will be with Molly Aitken. We're going to talk about her book, Burnout Bride, which is your second novel. And I absolutely loved it. I am a historical author myself, and I recognise in somebody else the ability to communicate an era bygone and an era which actually also relates very much to where we are today. Please, we need these mics to so that people who are joining us online can hear what we're saying. So Molly and I are going to chat for maybe 40 minutes, and then we're going to open to questions. If you have any questions, we'd love to hear them. And I will repeat your questions so that people online can hear them. And then we will ask the questions. And those books will be on sale at the end, obviously, the bookshop. Please put your hands together to welcome Molly. Molly, this book is set in Ireland in Kilkenny, which is a medieval town still, really is. And it's almost as if Kilkenny is a character in the book, I think. Tell me about your relationship to Kilkenny and research you had to do to relate to that as a medieval town.
So I've been to Kilkenny as a child, and always as a child, like wherever I travelled, if there was something historical, I kind of felt a pull to it. And then would imagine who lived there. Possibly you do the same. And I still do it now as well. But it didn't like occur to me to write anything about it at the time. And then the story of Alice Kitler was one that I'd heard as a child. She was kind of painted as this villainous, very like typical witch figure, and kind of portrayed as the type of woman us Catholic girls should not ever be like.
Be like Alice.
Exactly. And the teacher who told me about her, that message kind of worked. I was quite afraid of her. And I don't think I even realised that she was from Kilkenny. I don't think I made that connection. So Alice was the first woman who was ever formally accused of witchcraft in Ireland, but also within UK. And there weren't many other cases even within Europe more widely that we know of.
So give us the year. Give us the year.
It was 1324. Yeah, a long, long time ago. 700 years exactly, actually. Which I didn't realise until the book. 700 years. So yeah, I then started thinking about her again during lockdown, and I kind of heard her voice coming to me, and I felt like she really wanted her side of the story to be told. And the bishop who accused her, that's really where we get the story from. It's a very kind of misogynistic, quite sexist view of her. And that voice kind of came to me, and I was thinking about the novel, but I was in Sheffield, which is where I still live. And I couldn't get out of Sheffield because it was 2020. So I really had to pull on maps and photography and my own memories, which were very foggy, and sort of these childlike impressions. It was quite impressionistic, my memories of Kilkenny. Now it is still a medieval town.
It's on the sea, isn't it?
No, it's further in.
It's
further in. There's a river. A river, yeah. And eventually the story leads to the sea. But it's quite rare in Ireland to have that kind of left. We don't have many kind of older towns in that way, but you can still go. And a lot of the layout is similar to how it would have been years ago. And in fact, Alice was an innkeeper, and her inn is still exactly the same, pretty much. It's a pub now, so you can go in for things.
So when did you first go to Alice's pub?
It was I think in 23. Yeah, early 23. I also had a baby. which also prevented me from leaving. So yeah, it was a long time. I'd already written a draft, just using kind of information that I got.
So was there a big disparity? That's really interesting that you went back there, and did you have to go through it and edit and say, oh, the wall's in the wrong place?
Yeah, there was a couple of things, but mostly it was right. It was very kind of small technical things, like how long it might take to get from one end of the street to another, or yeah, little things like that, but nothing major.
Now let's talk about Alice, because you've created this very rounded character. She's a really goodie. She's a little bit of a baddie, isn't she? Tell us about Alice and her activities.
Yes. So, as I said, she was the first woman who was ever accused of witchcraft in Ireland. And that story that I was told as a child was really about the accusations. She was like firstly accused of killing her 4 husbands, which, you know, was quite a biggie. And that was, but there was also kind of the hubble bubble kind of witchy things in there as well. But the more I started diving into it, the less likely it seemed that she was actually a witch. She was a money lender at the time. She was incredibly wealthy, very influential. And it just didn't seem to fit in my view that she was really practicing witchcraft. People did at that time. It was like perfectly acceptable.
When you say witchcraft, do you mean like herbalism?
Yeah, yes, exactly. Like how you go to for the usual, or maybe trouble at home, or you know, you're wanting to have a child or something like that. But yeah, it was pretty clear to me from my research that that wasn't what she was doing. But it was her stepchildren who accused her. And it seemed like they just wanted to get her money. She was so rich, and the bishop at the time was kind of interested in witchcraft. The tide was just kind of starting to turn at that point within the church. And I think he really just saw a case, and he was like, I'm not sure we can get her for murder, but I have another idea. But also she just seemed to me like a very, brave figure. Not like a classic scapegoat, which you kind of often would read about in witch stories. It's often like a kind of, I suppose, poor woman who has no one to support her. Maybe she's a widow. And that was not the case with this at all. She was incredibly powerful, and she fought back. I just found that really interesting, because I felt like I hadn't heard stories like that before, particularly out of Ireland. We don't talk much about the women from the past. I mean, usually comes with women here as well, but that also felt important to me, representing.
Is there a monument in Kilkenny to Alice, or some kind of memorial?
So her pub is called Kitler's Inn. I have a problem with this. So there should be a monument. In Kitler's Inn, there's a big statue taller than you or I, and it's this very ugly classical witch woman with the hat, with the broom, with the cats.
It sounds like a terrible monument.
It's a terrible monument.
A really bad one. Okay. And what does it say?
It just says her name. I mean, it's inside the inn. It's up where the lads will be doing the session. Okay. So yeah, where you listen to your music, she's there hanging over them. But she is saying that she is kind of valued within Kilkenny. She's like a tourist attraction. But I don't feel that she is kind of portrayed in Kilkenny in the way that I sort of see her. I think it's much more through the lens of the bishop.
So let's maybe have a little reading. Have you got a little bit about Alice? Shall I hold your? Because you're going to have to look the book. It's a very complicated operation. I'm going to open. Her beard is bloody. She stands on the edge of the forest. Beside her lies a dead ram, his neck gaping open, severed, red in the snow. My father told me all of Ireland's wildcats were slaughtered by the Romans before those men left our shores.
1,000 years ago or more. But once my mother whispered to me, said that when she was still a girl, she met a lynx with her bare lips. And here I am, 9 winters grown, beyond my city's walls, and my wildcat crouches so close to me, I can smell her. Flesh and blood. I reach for her, knowing when I grasp her, she will carry me off into the forest. And there, with no one watching, we'll dance and whirl and run, run, run. My hand hovers between her ears. I am ready to be taken, to throw back my head and roar. But a whistle slices between us, and her eyes blaze with fear. Or is it rage now? Before I can vanish with her, she has become a flash of gold between the tree trunks. I turn, my eyes stinging with the loss of her. And there, beneath Kilkenny's walls, is a shepherd, his dogs rounding up the flock, and racing towards me across the snow moss meadow is my mother, her hair flying free from its cap, the flame of candle about to burn.
That's beautiful. So there's lots of questions that arose from that reading. One of them, though, is Alice is a mother, stepmother, and that is the root of some of her, some of her problems and issues. Yeah. You've written about mothers before, so your first novel, The Island Child, is very much a novel about mothers and children. Why is this such an interest for you? What is it about mothers that is in your mind that you're exploring?
With my first book, The Island Child, I was really fascinated with that relationship. And actually, in earlier drafts, people had suggested to me to make it more romantic and make that the kind of key relationship. And I just wasn't very interested in that. And I felt like the dynamic between a mother and a daughter was much more complicated and messy. And when I wrote that book as well, I wasn't a mother, but I wanted to be one. And so that was kind of something I was wondering how they relate to each other and kind of the things that we carry on from our mothers. And then within Bright I Burn, it just felt like a beautiful kind of symbol to have the mother as being like quite a wild and witchy, in a sense, figure. She's much more in touch with nature, and I think it was really a spoiler to say that she dies when Alice is a child. It's in the first chapter. And Alice kind of loses that kind of wild and natural elements of herself and becomes much more like her father, who's very business orientated and maybe in some ways like more domesticated. And so that kind of wildcat element of her is then gone. And I was interested in that juxtaposition between the two, and it felt a nice way to explore it.
She is a predator, though, Alice, isn't she? She is very much like, if you are weak, she will come for you.
Yes. She's actually ruthless, particularly in business. I'd never written about a woman like that before, and I hadn't read many women like that. Or even like within history books, seeing them even portrayed that way, even if they might have been that way, the historians might not have written about them in that way or kind of judged them. So I found that really interesting. It was really fun to kind of get into the skin and see people through her eyes.
Because it's not what you think of as a traditional medieval woman. You think of that kind of, courtly, knightly ideal of, I'll just fling you a hand and then you can fight a battle for me. That's very much it. But Alice is very much someone who's fighting her own battles. Did you archive dive and find these kind of women in the archive to sort of base bits of Alice upon?
Yes. I mean, I was lucky enough to actually go to the archive in Kilkenny, and they have an amazing archive there. So I have so much material on her. Most of it not actually from the time that she was alive, unfortunately. It's a lot of kind of later interpretations of her. And again, most of them are based on the accounts of the bishop. So I would find myself in the archive just getting even more angry because I could almost feel her, like sense her sitting beside me and just getting furious about all these representations of her which were quite, let's say, judgmental and often misogynistic. And painting her in one way as just being ruthless and not really giving a reason why. And I kept asking, like, why was she doing the things that she did? Why were people talking about her in this way? Why might she have acted ruthlessly? Because there's always an answer to that, but no one seemed curious about it.
A ruthless, like you're often reading stuff from the medieval and there's been a fight and somebody's, you know, hanging someone's mum off the side of a castle in a cage at the end of a war, and you're like, oh, the medieval is brutal, like absolutely brutal. So it is very much of that time, isn't it? That kind of, you know, very practical, very pragmatic, kind of heartless thing.
Yeah, that's exactly it. I mean, I think we cast a lot of judgment on behaviors from back then, but we don't really know how we would behave if we were alive then, I think. And I think Alice had to be quite ruthless to get where she did, and to become as rich and influential as she became. Now, she didn't necessarily need to be that rich and influential, but she must have wanted to, and the way to get there, especially as a woman, I think, because it was harder as a woman, was to be more ruthless.
And one of the weapons in Alice's arsenal is definitely sex.
Yes.
It's a very sexy novel.
Yes.
4 husbands.
Yes.
So let's talk about medieval sex.
Yes, that was very fun to research, I have to say. I had this opinion of medieval women, and probably a lot of us do, where thinking that like they were very buttoned up and like sex was very controlled by the church. And actually, I think that was based on my own kind of upbringing in Ireland. And I was bringing that lens to it, assuming that that's what it was like. But actually, the more I researched, the more bizarre things I found. And the more I was sort of enjoying the fact that I could portray an Irish woman who actually enjoyed sex or was just like having sex and was open about it, because that's not something that even today we kind of think about for Irish women.
Read us a sexy bit.
So I have these sections throughout the book which are formatted a little differently, and they are sometimes they're gossip sections. So basically, people having a chat. And this one is between what's this older maid and a newer servant. So excuse my accent. He's limp as a limp fish. You'd think one so pretty as them. The more like angels their faces, the more like devils their genitals. The master's so very pleasing to look at. I've always preferred a man with a less girlish countenance myself, even a rough shepherd any day, a man that'd strangle a wolf. I like men who look like the master. Well, if you marry a man like the master, you'll need to charm what hangs between his legs. If the mistress would only come to me, I would tell her to manage it. Tell me, Alba. I'll try it myself. Rather you than me. But here's what you do. Get a live fish. I find a lamprey to be a good size, but you may prefer a brown trout. Insert the chosen fish alive inside yourself. Let it wriggle around for your pleasure until quite dead. Put your laugh in there. Once dead, take it to the kitchen and cook it in the way your husband likes his fish. The master prefers boiled to fry, imagine.
I love this because it really is redolent of the kind of things you quite often find in medieval, even Georgian manuscripts, where people have these mad sort of secret spells.
Yes.
Where you're like, don't do that. No, please do not do this.
Please don't take any advice.
We're not going to try this out.
Yeah, but this was just one of the examples that I found that I was like, has to go in. It has to go in.
And they're quite, it's, I suppose, when the differences between people, even if you have a lot of money, are very small, you play up the differences that you can to make most of your money. So her clothes, for example, are beautifully described. It's a very lush kind of world that you have created. Tell us about research for that. Are there any images of Alice?
There are no images of Alice. I mean, I feel like she was probably quite a vain person, and that's how I portrayed her in the book. So I feel like she might have commissioned something, but there's nothing actually that remains sadly of her specifically. We have one painting that was done, I think, in the 1950s, which again is her portrayed in a very kind of negative way, and kind of like wanton and angry looking. But that's it for Alice herself. I mean, there's so much to draw on in terms of like moving so much imagery, and I use that a lot, almost more than like Kilkenny itself. It was the kind of images to give it a kind of impressionistic feel, because
it's very sensual. I mean, I suppose in a lot of traditional historical novels, you're encouraged to enter a historical world through a war, through an act of legislation, through what is a very privileged male world, really. And so to enter a woman's world, you need that sensual entry point for food, for sex, for clothes, because that is the bit that we can relate to about women's lives.
Yeah, exactly. So I was drawing a lot on food and also things that we can all relate to as well still. And I think that gives a really good access point for readers now. And even for me, I think it helped me to enter her world where I think about what food she would be eating, what her clothes would feel like. And I find that much like an easier way to write about that. That yeah,
you can relate.
Yeah.
Why historical fiction for you? Because both your books are set in the past, and so much further in the past than Young and Child. You've written short stories that are contemporary as well. So tell me about why history. What is it that is drawing you? Because it clearly is drawing to that subject. You know, just to the past in general.
Yeah. I mean, it's always been a fascination for me, even since childhood. I studied classics at university, so what I'm working on now might be something that you've grown inspired. I'm retelling a myth from the point of view of Romulus and Remus' mother. Yeah, who was Romulus and Remus? Sylvia, goddess of the Tiber. And many interesting things happened to her, but we don't really know anything about her. And I think this is part of why I'm so drawn to history, is that when I was a child, I would read all these stories of wars and men arguing about things, and I kept trying to find myself, and I never could. You'd have to kind of dig, and there would be a woman on the side, probably not saying anything, and I just felt like that probably wasn't what was happening.
And so, what were you looking for those women to give you, though? Why?
Yeah, I think an access point into that world.
Yeah,
I don't know how you feel about it, but like when I read about history, I really want to enter it in a way, and writing allows us to do that, to time travel, reading and writing it.
So I think that's absolutely true. I think a really good historical novel is a time machine.
Yeah,
and it allows you to go back and understand where you come from, and therefore perhaps understand better where you are.
Yeah.
So in terms of Bright I Burn, what remains of Alice's world, Alice's issues in Ireland in particular? Because it's an Irish story. This is not a Scottish witch. So tell us, what's left of Alice in society? What do you have to teach from Alice's story?
Well, why I found her so interesting was because she was so, firstly, openly sexual, and in Ireland that is changing, but it's not really that normal, only just now. But then also because she was so ambitious. And I feel like even today, possibly here as well, women are not that openly ambitious. It's only just starting to happen. And I've never come across that many women in history who are just so aggressively want something and just go for it and do almost anything to get it. And that was something I took away from writing her. I really kind of
Be ambitious like
yes, well, I already was, but now I can admit it.
It's not it's not the four husbands thing. Like,
no,
I really want to have four husbands.
My husband was quite worried when I was writing this.
So how is the book being received now?
It's doing quite well. Yeah, it says it in the chart. It's in the charts. It's top 10 bestseller. Yes, we just found out today. Very exciting. Very exciting.
When you have another reading, a third reading, I think you do. Maybe while you're thinking questions they might like to ask.
Okay, this is just a short section called The Bed. When my marriage bed was made, it was carried for all to see through the streets of Kilkenny. The posts were carved with the leaves and flowers of an oak, but it was hewn from a yew, the eternal tree, the poisoner, masked as the king of the forest. It is simply a bed, but when I was 12, my father told me, beds are where we make children. But I knew beds are also where children can be unmade, where a man's force can dislodge them, before they have rooted strongly. In the safety of our beds, we are meant to mold our dreams, yet beds can be places where a child is forced to no longer be a child. I know that in my father's bed, my mother's nights were as white as mine, white with the need to run.
White with the need to run. And also just want to show everyone the cover there. Do you know who did this cover? It's beautiful wood carving sort of effect, isn't it? I love that she's a redhead. And I love that she's a redhead.
We don't know for sure, but there was interpretations later on that she must have been a redhead because
she got so cross.
Yeah. So I kept to that. It felt true.
Yeah. Would anyone like to ask? Sorry. Well, that's just a question. I'll just repeat for the people at home. So, you had said that Alice had spoken to her voice and manifested. So, what was that process like? Was it quick or slow? How did she come?
I always describe it as like a kind of haunting. And when I was thinking about taking on the book, I wasn't sure I actually wanted to do it. But I sat down, I decided because she was the woman who had lived, I would sit down and kind of talk to her. So I closed my eyes, I was thinking about it. And I had this sense that she was like leaning over my shoulder. And I heard this voice say to me, "Are you afraid?" And I said, and then I had this kind of sensation where she was walking around me and coming in front of me. And as she did that, she shrank and like became a child again. And at that moment, she said, "I'm afraid of myself too." And that was when I felt like, oh, I think I understand you. I can write about you. I didn't start writing immediately. I did research and kind of mapped it out. But when I started writing, I had this sense that actually she would have used any writer who was available. And I was just like, the host who had agreed. And so the voice came quite easily. It came out quite quickly. I did edit it quite a lot. But
what are the differences between those drafts, your first draft and your final draft? What kind of things?
So the first one was quite mad. It just kind of all came out, and my son was also a baby at the time, so I think it was partly sleep deprivation. And then I sent it to my editor and so it was like her voice was completely there, but it was just kind of almost like stream of consciousness. So it required almost domesticating. It was like that was her true self, but I needed to make her palatable to the public.
Are you aware of the reader when you're writing?
I don't think about it too much. I don't know about you, but I feel like that gets in the way for me. I think about myself as a reader and what I want, and that's enough. I do know writers who kind of think of a different person each time they're writing and kind of write towards that, which I find quite lovely, and maybe I'll take that on. But just myself.
Yeah. Writer and the reader. You are
Yeah. I guess this is the kind of historical fiction that I would like to read. Which is like slightly more experimental maybe than what we sometimes get.
The 14th century was kind of all opposite. So very differently to the way we turn now in 2023 and 2024. How do you, what resources could you look at to kind of like verify and compare the accuracy of the language compared to what you know, what you've lived, to how you could accurately portray Alice's voice in 14th century language?
That's a great question. So the question is, and the 14th century is very, very deal of time ago, and people's lexicon was quite different. How did you interpret that to be true to it, but also make it palatable to the modern reader? And I have a supplementary question. What language did Alice speak in 14th century Kilkenny?
So she would have spoken a few languages. At that time in Ireland, people would have spoken English. It depends whether you were a settled kind of Irish or actually native Irish, where you would have spoken Gaelic. But she would have had bits of Gaelic, possibly, we don't know. Definitely would have spoken French. She was an innkeeper, so people would come through her door. So I kind of assumed that she would have bits and pieces of lots of languages, actually. But primarily English. But yes, to answer your question, I read like literature of the time, poetry, the Bible, and lots of different things, and took elements of that. But actually, I then kind of let it all go and just wrote it, hoping that maybe like remnants of that would survive. But actually, I didn't worry too much about that. I was just trying to, I am writing for myself, I am writing for readers today, and we do speak quite different. And so, I wanted it just to flow.
I wrote in my notes, actually, when I was reading the book, this feels like some of it has the rhythm of Gaelic. And I really felt that about it. So, she might have spoken some.
Maybe, yeah.
Oh. Question from online at the back, I think.
Yes, so this is a question from Sal. What is it like to write into a cultural moment where there is so much interest in witches and in righting historical wrongs done to women through history?
It's a great question, Sal. So, should I repeat that? They can't hear you. Yes, you're on the phone. So, what is the relevance really of writing now about witches? When there are so many other books and telling those stories, lost stories of women and telling those voices.
So part of why I really wanted to write this particular story was because it was the first case, really. And I'd never really seen anyone do it before. There's been like a couple of little kind of mentions of her in the books, but nothing that really focused on her point of view. And that just felt like too good of an opportunity to miss. And also just because of that thing of, you know, people don't know much about Irish women in history. And I was reading all these books about the period, and no one was mentioning her, even if the book was just about women. And she was such a huge figure in Ireland and had impacts also within England. She meant the equivalent of millions to the Queen of England at the time. And so that kind of frustrated me. I wanted to give her a place within this kind of orchestra of all these mostly women's stories of witchcraft.
But the Irish witch hunts, mostly in Scotland, it was sort of 86, 87% women who were, is it the same in Ireland?
Well, we actually have very few cases. I feel like they maybe chose the wrong person with her and learned their lesson. So luckily we actually don't have many cases at all in Ireland. And that's partly, I think, because the Irish don't like to think of ourselves as, you know, siding with Satan, I'd say. Like, we think of ourselves as a land of saints and, you know, being on the right side of history. So I think that might kind of lean into the fact that it just didn't happen very often. But yeah, a part of what I found so interesting about writing about it today as well was how there's similarities really in how we gossip about people, and that was something I found really interesting. The gossip sections, I kind of was influenced a little bit by some of the commentary that I see online on social media of like attacking and the kind of the stuff that can just build up into almost nothing. So that was always at the back of my mind as well. I think it's still happening, just in different forms. So it's definitely still relevant and worth thinking about.
It's curiously it almost feels like it's curiously not physically violent, it's more emotionally violent. Although it's no secret that Alice didn't make it, but you know, that she died in the end. But it almost feels like real violence actually wasn't physical.
Yes, it was just slow build up of, I think, jealousy. That's certainly what I think in the book, but also this growing hatred towards this woman who became so powerful. And I think this one bishop was just very frustrated. He came in from England, an Englishman, and he didn't know the community the way she did, and she had much more power and influence than he did, and that was
hated that.
Yes, exactly. And I think the two of them underestimated each other, which is why the fight went on as it did.
Anyone got another question online there?
Yeah. So this one is from June. Do you have a historical tool on that?
No, you go ahead. Is the genre of historical fiction constraining because there are facts to take into account as versus the summary?
Yeah, I don't find it constraining at all, and I'm curious to hear your answer of this. I think it helps to have the research as a kind of map. Otherwise, I think we're just writing fantasy, which is a lovely thing to do. But I actually like to have a layout, and often I found the research would give me a much more interesting answer or solution to some problem that I might have within the text than making it up myself. Often if I was getting stuck in the writing, I would just turn to research and the answer would appear from some old manuscript or, yeah.
I think when I write, I want to write the stories that aren't there. So I'm writing in between the gaps of that research, and it's often the gaps that attract me. So I'll find that there is a story there, and I'm like, well, who is missing from this story? What would they have to say about this? And so I find it like a framework. But interestingly, a few years ago, I was down in London and I did an event with Ben Aronovich, and Ben writes fantasy fiction. He writes a series called The Rivers of London, in which it's like, so it's almost like the Bill meets Harry Potter. It's like a fantasy police force in London. And we did this event together. And when we were talking about it afterwards, it turns out you get the same complaints. So people will get in touch with me and say, well, you know, there were no gay people in 1835, and you're like, really? But he was getting, this magical system is nonsense. This magic would not work. You know, that is rubbish. And so it's quite interesting. People that want to criticize your stuff are just going to criticize your stuff. And I suppose we're both writing into gaps in some ways.
Yeah, and there is imagination there for sure. I mean, I do the same, I think, but
constructing somewhere that allows you to understand our world so much. So it's about voices that aren't there, because, you know, ultimately, I think we very often have this concept of history as, you know, everyone agreed with the Prime Minister. Everyone thought this was great. They won the battle, so they won, so everyone agreed. No one has ever agreed. We are a troublesome bunch and always have been. And also, I quite often love writing the people who got it wrong. You know, the people who opposed the women's suffrage, the people who thought we really ought to keep slavery. These are mad people. And I suppose the lesson to learn from those people is, you know, you can think you're right, but you might be wrong. So that those characters are always really interesting, I think. Yeah. Your bishop thinks he's right. He's wrong.
Yes. Well, yeah, a lot of people still think he's right, but I think he's wrong.
Would you say there's still a belief in that now? Because Ireland is very much built on the church. Like, having lived in Ireland, I was in Ireland the year you were born.
Yeah, I know.
And you couldn't get the pill unless you were married.
Yeah.
You know, I was coming back to Scotland and stocking up and dealing like Ireland to my pals at college, because you couldn't get it. Yeah, it's shocking. You couldn't get the pill unless you were married. So, you know, Ireland has a much greater connection to that kind of misogyny, that kind of control. That's still, I think.
Yeah, I think that's a lot of what I write against in both of my books, actually. You don't see it as much now, to be fair, but my experience of rural Ireland when I was a child was really still that way. And my mother was actually known as the witch in our village, yes, because she read tarot and she was also divorced. I know, shocking. So I think there's a kind of me writing against that gossip as well. But yeah, it's still kind of simmering in the background in Ireland, but luckily things have changed a lot, and I think actually now is a time for stories like Alice's to be rebirthed in a sense and looked at from new angles, because I think just not many people have really questioned the bishop's account of what happened.
I think it's also really important for young women that, you know, very often you think you have to be the first. You always have to be the first. And in fact, you know, Alice was an amazing businesswoman. There was, in the 13th century, there was a tax collector, a female tax collector in Dundee, who was greatly feared and tremendously good at her job. And I'm sure there are tax collectors since who think, well, I'm the first woman, but absolutely not. So I think it's really important actually to show that there has been female achievement, and despair, and all the rest of it in the past, because those are shoulders you can stand on.
Yeah, and I think it's kind of the responsibility of fiction writers to step in and tell their stories, because they're not written really in history books because there's not enough there. It is the gaps that you were speaking about, and historians aren't really allowed to fill in those gaps, but we can do that. So
hurrah, what a great job. Listen, it's a lovely note to end on. So we have books for sale, and I think that Molly would be quite happy to sign them. Please put your hands together and say thank you to the wonderful Molly Aitken. Thank you all for coming.